February 1945, the Netherlands. Lieutenant Sydney Valpy Radley-Walters pressed his eye against the periscope sight of his Sherman tank and felt his stomach drop. 300 yards ahead, a German Tiger tank rolled into view between two farmhouses. The massive machine looked like a steel fortress on tracks. Its gun barrel was nearly 12 feet long. The armor on its front was 4 inches thick. Radley-Walters knew his Sherman 75mm gun might as well be shooting pebbles at that range. The Tiger could kill him from over a mile away. He could barely scratch the Tiger from 3 football fields. This was the problem killing Canadian tank crews across Holland. The manual said to aim for the Tiger's front armor or try to hit its tracks. But the front armor was too thick. The 75mm shells just bounced off like rubber balls hitting concrete. And hitting the tracks meant getting close. Very close. Close enough that the Tiger's massive 80mm gun would turn the Sherman into a burning coffin. The math was simple and terrible. For every Tiger tank the Canadians destroyed, they lost 3 or 4 Shermans, sometimes more. Each Sherman held 5 men. Each Tiger held 5 men. The numbers did not add up to anything good. The land itself made everything worse. Holland was not like France or Belgium. Here, the fields were below sea level. The Dutch had built walls of earth called dikes to keep the ocean out. Roads ran along the top of these dikes. They were narrow. Only one tank could fit. There was no room to go around. The fields on both sides were flooded on purpose. The Germans had blown up the pumps. Now water covered everything. A Sherman that rolled off the dike would sink into 8 feet of cold, muddy water. This meant the Canadian tankers could not do what they were trained to do. The training manual said to flank the enemy, circle around, hit them from the side where the armor was thinner, but you cannot flank an enemy when there is only one road and water on both sides. You had to face the Tiger head-on, and facing a Tiger head-on in a Sherman was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Radley-Walters had seen it happen too many times already. A Tiger would appear at the far end of a dike road. The lead Sherman would fire. The shell would hit the Tiger's front and bounce away with a bright orange spark. The Tiger would fire back. 1 shot. The Sherman would explode. Fire would pour from every hatch. If the crew was lucky, they got out. Usually they were not lucky. The next Sherman in line would try the same thing. Same result. Orange spark. Then fire. And black smoke. The British generals said this was acceptable. They said Tigers were rare. They said the Canadians just needed to be more aggressive. Get closer. Fire more shells. But Radley-Walters was not a normal tank officer. He had not grown up in tanks. He had been an artillery officer first. Artillery officers thought differently. They thought about angles. They thought about where shells went. After they hit something. They did not just think about punching through armor. They thought about what happened when armor could not be punched through. During training exercises back in England, Radley-Walters had noticed something strange. When practice shells hit the curved front of a Tiger's gun mantlet, they did not bounce straight back. The mantlet was the big round piece of armor that surrounded the gun barrel. It stuck out from the turret face. It was over 12 inches thick and curved like a dome. When shells hit that curve, they bounced downward, not away. Down. Radley-Walters had mentioned this to his gunnery sergeant. The sergeant had shrugged. Everyone knew you could not hurt a Tiger by hitting the mantlet. The mantlet was the thickest armor on the whole tank. But Radley-Walters kept thinking about it. He kept thinking about angles. He kept thinking about where those shells were going. If they bounced down off the mantlet curve at a 30-degree angle, where did they go? They would hit the top of the hull, the roof armor, and roof armor was always thin. Tanks were built to fight other tanks. Tank guns fired level or slightly up. Nobody expected shots to come from above. So the top armor on most tanks was only 1 inch thick, sometimes less. He had tried to explain this to his company commander. The commander had listened politely. Then he had said what all the experienced tankers said. The mantlet was too small a target. It was only 18 inches across. Trying to hit an 18-inch target at combat range was lottery shooting. You might get lucky once, but you would waste hundreds of shells trying. Shells were precious. Better to aim for the tracks, disable the Tiger, and call for artillery or air support. Radley-Walters had tried to explain again. This was not about luck. This was about geometry. The mantlet was curved in a way that sent shells exactly where you wanted them to go. If you hit it at the right spot, the shell would deflect straight down into the thinnest part of the entire tank. The commander had smiled. He had told Radley-Walters to stick to what worked, stick to the manual. The manual had been written by men with years of experience. The manual had been proven in Africa and Italy and France. Young lieutenants did not rewrite the manual because they noticed something during practice. The regiment's senior gunnery officer had been even more direct. He had called the idea nonsense. He had shown Radley-Walters the thickness measurements. The mantlet was 320 millimeters thick. That was 12.5 inches of solid steel. Shells that hit it would shatter or bounce away. They would not magically punch through 12 inches of armor just because the armor was curved. The whole idea showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how anti-tank warfare worked. Better to focus on proven methods. Better to trust the experts. So Radley-Walters had kept quiet. He had followed orders. He had aimed for tracks and front armor like everyone else. But he had kept watching. And he had kept thinking about angles, about curves, about thin roof armor, and about how sometimes the spot everyone called wrong might actually be exactly right. The first chance came on February 8th, 1945, near the town of Nijmegen. Radley-Walters was not even in the lead tank that day. He was third in line on a narrow dike road. Ahead of him, Trooper Ed Perkin sat in the gunner's seat of the lead Sherman. Perkin was 22 years old. He had been a farmhand in Saskatchewan before the war. He knew how to aim a rifle at gophers from 200 yards. Now he aimed a tank gun at Germans. The Tiger appeared suddenly around a bend in the road. It was 800 yards away. That was half a mile, close enough to see clearly, far enough that neither tank could move quickly. The Tiger commander saw the Shermans first. His massive gun began to turn. Perkin knew he had maybe 10 seconds before that gun finished turning and fired. 10 seconds to do something. His lieutenant had been talking about the mantlet shot for weeks. Everyone thought the lieutenant was crazy. But Perkin had nothing to lose. The standard frontal shot would just bounce off anyway. Perkin put his sight reticle on the dark circle where the Tiger's gun barrel stuck out. The mantlet. The round dome of thick armor. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. He took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The Sherman rocked backward. The smell of cordite filled the inside of the tank. Perkin watched through his sight. The tracer showed his shell flying straight. It hit the mantlet dead center with a bright spark. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the Tiger seemed to jump. A jet of orange flame shot up from the turret ring. The whole top of the Tiger lifted slightly. Black smoke poured out. The German crew hatches flew open. Men climbed out fast, their uniforms smoking. Perkin sat frozen. The other crew members were yelling. They were cheering. The radio crackled with voices asking what happened. Perkin's tank commander leaned down and slapped his shoulder. They had killed a Tiger with one shot from the front. Everyone said it was impossible. But there the Tiger sat, burning like a bonfire. When Radley-Walters heard the report, his heart started pounding. He grabbed his binoculars and looked at the burning Tiger. He could see the hole, not in the mantlet. The mantlet looked fine except for the impact mark. The hole was in the top of the hull, right behind where the turret sat. Exactly where he had predicted. The shell had hit the curved mantlet and bounced straight down into the roof armor. The roof armor was only 1 inch thick. The deflected shell had punched through like paper, but the after-action report called it a lucky shot. The company commander wrote that Trooper Perkin had scored a fortunate hit through some weak point in the Tiger's armor. There was no mention of the mantlet, no mention of deflection. Just luck. Radley-Walters tried to explain. Nobody wanted to listen. One lucky shot did not prove anything. Then it happened again. 4 days later, a different crew, a different Tiger. Same result. The gunner had aimed for the mantlet because he heard about Perkin's kill. He figured he would try it. Why not? The shell hit the curved armor. It bounced down. The Tiger exploded. This time, Radley-Walters was close enough to see it happen. He watched the shell's path through his binoculars. He saw the deflection. He saw exactly where the shell went after it hit. This time, someone important was watching too. Lieutenant Colonel Mel Gordon commanded the entire regiment. He had been moving up to observe the engagement. He had seen the whole thing through his own binoculars. After the fight, Gordon called Radley-Walters to his command tank. Gordon was not like the other senior officers. He had started the war as a sergeant. He had worked his way up. He trusted his eyes more than manuals. Gordon asked Radley-Walters to explain the shot. Radley-Walters showed him the geometry. The mantlet curved out at a 30-degree angle from the turret face. When a shell hit that curve, it deflected downward at roughly the same angle. 30 degrees down from level meant the shell would hit the top of the hull. The top of the hull was covered by armor only 25 millimeters thick. That was 1 inch. A Sherman 75 millimeter armor-piercing shell could punch through 1 inch of steel at 1,200 yards. Easy. Gordon stared at the smoking Tiger for a long time. Then he made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. He ordered every gunner in the regiment to practice the mantlet shot, not as a backup plan, as the primary method for engaging Tigers. They would dedicate 200 practice rounds to learning this shot. 200 rounds was a lot of ammunition. The British armored doctrine advisors were furious when they heard. They said Gordon was wasting precious shells on trick shooting. They said he was filling his men's heads with dangerous ideas. They said Tigers should be engaged according to established doctrine or avoided entirely. Gordon ignored them. He set up practice targets in a field behind the lines. The targets were painted circles 18 inches across. That was the size of a Tiger's mantlet. The gunners practiced from different ranges: 800 yards, 1,000 yards, 1,200 yards. These were the distances where they usually saw Tigers in Holland. At first, the hit rate was terrible. Maybe 1 shot in 20 hit the circle. But these were farm boys and factory workers. They knew how to practice. They knew how to get better. After 5 days of practice, the hit rate climbed to 40%. 4 shots out of 10 would hit an 18-inch circle at 1,000 yards. That was better than the 5% chance of a frontal armor penetration. Much better. And the mantlet shot worked every single time it hit. The geometry never lied. Hit the curve. The shell goes down. The Tiger dies. It was predictable, reliable, mathematical. The technique spread through the regiment like wildfire. Gunners talked to other gunners. Crews that scored kills shared their aiming points. The most experienced crews started teaching the newer ones. They learned to account for range. At 800 yards, aim at the top of the mantlet. At 1,200 yards, aim at the center. The shell would drop slightly in flight. The deflection angle would change slightly, but the principle stayed the same. Curve means deflection. Deflection means roof armor. Roof armor means death. Word reached the other Canadian armored regiments. Some commanders were interested. Others were skeptical. The British liaison officers called it Canadian voodoo. They said it violated every principle of armored warfare. You did not aim for thick armor and hope for ricochets. You aimed for weak points and made sure of penetration. But the Canadians had something the British officers did not have. They had dead Tigers. Tigers killed from the front. Tigers killed with single shots. The proof was burning in Dutch fields all across the front line. By the end of February, 3 Canadian armored regiments were practicing the mantlet shot. Gordon had taken what everyone called the wrong way to fight and turned it into standard operating procedure. The textbook said it would not work. The experts said it was impossible. The Tigers sitting in smoking ruins said otherwise. Sometimes geometry beats experience. Sometimes a young lieutenant with an artillery background sees what veteran tankers miss. And sometimes the thickest armor on the tank is exactly where you should aim. The numbers told a story that nobody could argue with. Between February 8th and March 15th, 1945, Canadian tank crews destroyed 30 Tiger tanks using the mantlet deflection shot. 30. That was more Tigers than some entire divisions killed in a year. Before the mantlet technique, the Canadians expected to lose 3 or 4 Shermans for every Tiger they destroyed. Sometimes the ratio was even worse. 5 or 6 Shermans burning for 1 Tiger kill. The math predicted they should have lost somewhere between 90 and 120 Shermans to kill 30 Tigers. Instead, they lost 12 Shermans instead of over 100. Each Sherman held 5 men. The lives saved numbered in the hundreds. The kill ratio had flipped completely. Instead of 4 Shermans lost for every Tiger killed, it was now 2.5 Tigers killed for every Sherman lost. The numbers did not lie. The technique worked. By mid-February, word had spread to every Canadian armored regiment fighting in Holland. Gunners who had scored mantlet kills became celebrities in their units. Other crews wanted to know exactly how they aimed, what they looked for, how they adjusted for range and wind. The 4th Canadian Armored Division made the mantlet shot their official doctrine for engaging Tigers. Training officers set up more practice targets. More crews spent their rest days shooting at 18-inch circles. The British liaison officers watched with tight lips and crossed arms. This was not how things were supposed to be done. The German tank commanders noticed the change fast. Tigers that used to dominate dike roads were suddenly exploding from frontal hits. At first, the Germans thought the Canadians had gotten new guns. Maybe the Americans had sent them Shermans with 76-meter guns instead of 75-meter guns. The bigger gun could punch through more armor. But prisoners said no. Same old Shermans, same old 75-meter guns, just a different way of shooting. The Germans adapted. Tiger commanders started positioning their tanks hull down whenever possible. Hull down meant hiding the bottom of the tank behind a hill or wall. Only the turret stuck up above cover. This protected the thin roof armor from deflection shots. But Holland did not have many hills. The land was flat as a table, and hiding hull down meant the Tiger could not move forward. It became a stationary pillbox instead of a mobile threat. The Canadians learned to go around or call in artillery. A stationary Tiger was much easier to deal with than a moving one. The sound of the mantlet shot became familiar to Canadian tank crews. First came the bang of their own gun firing. Then a brief moment of silence as the shell flew. Then the distinctive clang of metal hitting metal as the shell struck the curved mantlet. It was a different sound than hitting flat armor. Flatter armor made a sharp crack. The curved mantlet made a ringing clang like a hammer hitting a bell. Then came the best sound of all. The deep whump of ammunition cooking off inside the Tiger. Orange flames would shoot up from the turret ring. The turret would lift slightly, like a lid on a boiling pot. Black smoke would pour out thick and fast. The smell of cordite from their own gun mixed with the smell of burning oil and rubber from the dying Tiger. On cold February mornings, these smells hung in the air like fog. Radio chatter became almost cheerful. "Mantlet shot! Mantlet shot!" crews would call out. "She's brewing!" Brewing was what they called it when a tank caught fire. Like brewing tea. Dark humor for a dark job. The British armored doctrine officers hated everything about this. They filed official complaints. They said the Canadians were teaching bad habits. Armor warfare was about discipline and proper procedure. You did not aim for thick armor and pray for lucky bounces. You aimed for weak points with high probability of penetration. The mantlet shot was trick shooting. It was circus nonsense. It might work a few times by chance, but it would fail when it really mattered. The Canadians were wasting ammunition and giving their crews false confidence. Better to stick with proven methods. Better to trust decades of armored warfare experience. Some Canadian crews agreed with the British, mostly older. Veterans who had fought in Italy and France. They had survived by following the book. The book said, aim for tracks or try to flank. The book had kept them alive. Why change now? These crews kept shooting the old way. They aimed for tracks. They waited for flank shots. And they kept dying at the old rates. After a few weeks, most of them switched to the mantlet shot. The proof was hard to ignore when the new crews were surviving and the old method crews were burning. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon wrote in his war diary on February 26th, "The Germans built the finest tank in the world, then gave it a glass jaw." The phrase spread through the regiment. Men painted it on their tanks. They joked about it in letters home. The Tiger had been the monster that haunted their nightmares. Now it had a weakness everyone could exploit. The fear did not go away completely. A Tiger was still deadly. One shot from its 80mm gun would still kill a Sherman instantly. But now the Canadians had a reliable way to shoot back. They were not helpless anymore. German prisoners were confused and angry. They had been told the Tiger was invincible from the front. They had been promised that Allied tanks could not hurt them unless they got lucky with a side or rear shot. Now they were being killed from straight ahead. Over and over. The prisoners asked their interrogators what kind of new gun the Canadians had. When told it was still the same old 70mm gun, they did not believe it. Some thought it was a trick. Some thought the Canadians had special ammunition. Nobody wanted to accept that their mighty Tiger had a fatal flaw that any enemy could use. American tank units heard about the Canadian technique in March. Some wanted to try it. Others were skeptical. The Americans had more Shermans than the Canadians. They could afford higher losses. Their doctrine was to swarm Tigers with numbers. Send 5 or 6 Shermans at once from different angles. Somebody would get a side shot eventually. It worked, but it was expensive. Still, American tank officers were cautious about adopting Canadian methods. They called it amateur hour. They said Canadians were lucky, not skilled. But a few American gunners practiced the mantlet shot anyway. When they scored kills, they kept quiet about it. They did not want to get in trouble for violating doctrine. The unexpected consequence was psychological. Canadian tank crews stopped fearing Tigers. They actually wanted to encounter them. A Tiger kill was a badge of honor. Proof of skill. Crews would argue about who spotted the Tiger first, who called the shot, whose shell actually made the kill when multiple tanks fired. This was the opposite of how things had been in January. Back then, seeing a Tiger meant panic and retreat. Now it meant an opportunity. The hunters had become the hunted. By mid-March, the full scale of the change was clear. 30 Tigers destroyed, 12 Shermans lost, over 400 lives saved. 3 Canadian armored regiments, using the technique as standard practice. German tank tactics changed across the entire Holland front. British officers still complaining, but unable to argue with results. And all because one lieutenant with an artillery background had watched shells bounce off curved armor during training and wondered where they went. The wrong spot had become the right spot. The impossible shot had become routine. And the Tiger, the most powerful tank in the world, had learned to fear the little Shermans with the clever Canadian gunners who knew their geometry. The war in Europe ended 2 months later, in May 1945. By then, the mantlet shot technique had spread far beyond the Canadian regiments where it started. In April, British tank units began teaching it to their crews despite the earlier objections from doctrine officers. Results were hard to argue with. When the technique saved British lives, just like it saved Canadian lives, the complaints stopped. American armored divisions added the mantlet shot to their training manuals as an alternate engagement method, not the primary method. The Americans still preferred their swarm tactics, but now their gunners knew they had another option if they faced a Tiger alone. The technique became a formal part of Commonwealth armored warfare training after the war ended. Officers studied what the Canadians had done in Holland. They analyzed the geometry. They measured the deflection angles precisely. They tested it against captured German tanks. Everything Radley-Walters had predicted turned out to be mathematically correct. A shell hitting the curved mantlet at the right spot would deflect downward at approximately 30 degrees. At that angle, it would strike the roof armor behind the turret ring. The roof armor was 25 millimeters thick on a Tiger and 40 millimeters thick on a Tiger II. Both thicknesses were well within penetration range for a 75 millimeter armor-piercing shell at combat distances. The math was simple. The physics were reliable. It worked every time if you hit the target. Tank designers took note. After the war, engineers studying armor protection realized that curved surfaces could be deadly traps. The Tiger's mantlet had been designed to deflect shells away from the tank. Instead, it had deflected them into the tank's weakest point. Post-war tank designs eliminated these kinds of shot traps. Mantlets became flatter or were hidden behind additional armor plates. Roof armor got thicker. The T-54 Soviet tank had roof armor twice as thick as the Tiger. The American M48 Patton tank had a completely redesigned turret with no deflection surfaces. Every major tank nation studied the mantlet problem. They made sure their new designs would not have the same weakness. The Tiger's fatal flaw became a lesson taught in every armor engineering school. Radley-Walters himself became a legend in Canadian military history. By the end of the war, he had 18 confirmed tank kills. That made him Canada's highest-scoring tank ace. Most of those kills came from the mantlet shot technique he had championed. He was promoted to major before the war ended. He received the Distinguished Service Order for his actions in Holland. The medal citation mentioned his tactical innovations and leadership under fire. It did not specifically mention the mantlet shot, but everyone knew what it meant. After the war, Radley-Walters stayed in the Canadian Army. He loved being a soldier. He loved leading men. He served in peacetime postings across Canada and Europe. He trained new generations of tank officers. He always taught them the mantlet shot story, not because he wanted credit, because he wanted them to understand an important lesson. The manual is not always right. Experts are not always correct. Sometimes a fresh perspective sees what experience misses. He told them to trust their eyes and their brains, to question things that did not make sense, to test ideas even when senior officers said those ideas were foolish. Radley-Walters retired as a Major General in 1975, 30 years of service. He had started as a young artillery lieutenant who knew nothing about tanks. He ended as one of Canada's most respected armor officers. He lived until 2015, dying at age 95. Near the end of his life, historians came to interview him about the mantlet shot. They wanted to know how he had figured it out. He told them it was simple geometry. Anyone who paid attention could have seen it. But most people did not pay attention. They just followed orders and trusted the manual. He said the real insight was not the geometry. The real insight was realizing that something everyone said was wrong might actually be right. Military historians estimate the mantlet shot technique saved between 200 and 300 Allied tank crew lives. That number comes from comparing loss rates before and after the technique was adopted. Each Sherman carried 5 men. Each life saved was a husband, father, son, or brother who came home instead of dying in a burning tank on a Dutch dike road. Those men had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. The ripples of Radley-Walters' observation spread through generations. The story became a case study in military innovation courses. Officers studying leadership and tactics learned about the young lieutenant who questioned conventional wisdom. They learned about the colonel who was willing to trust an unproven idea. They learned about the importance of adapting to circumstances instead of blindly following doctrine. The Canadian Army Staff College in Kingston still teaches the mantlet shot story. It sits right alongside famous battles and great generals. A reminder that innovation can come from anywhere. That junior officers sometimes see things senior officers miss. That rigidity gets people killed. The mantlet shot appears in modern discussions about tank warfare surprisingly often. During the Gulf War in 1991, American tank crews studied weak points on Iraqi T-72 tanks. They looked for shot traps and deflection surfaces. They found several. The knowledge came directly from lessons learned in World War II. When the war in Ukraine started in 2022, both sides immediately began analyzing weak points on enemy armor. Videos appeared online showing Ukrainian crews targeting specific spots on Russian tanks. Turret rings, vision blocks, areas where thinner armor met thicker armor. The principle was the same as the mantlet shot. Find the geometry. Exploit the weakness, survive the encounter. Modern armor design still struggles with the same problem the Tiger had. Tanks need thick armor to survive, but thick armor is heavy. Heavy tanks are slow and use lots of fuel. Engineers try to put thick armor where it matters most, the front, the turret face, the sides. But something has to be thin, usually the roof. Tanks are still most vulnerable from above. Modern anti-tank missiles attack from the top for exactly this reason. They fly up and come down on the thin roof armor, the Javelin missile, the Law, the Tau-2B. All of them exploit the same weakness Radley-Walters noticed in 1945. Roof armor is thin. Geometry is predictable. Physics does not change. The broader lesson reaches beyond tank warfare. Innovation often comes from people outside the established system, people who do not know what is supposed to be impossible. Radley-Walters was an artillery officer, not a tanker. He had not spent years being taught that you never aim for thick armor. He approached the problem fresh. He saw patterns that veterans had stopped seeing because they already knew the answer. This happens in every field: science, medicine, business, technology. The experts know so much that they sometimes miss simple truths. The outsider asks the obvious question nobody else thought to ask. Desperation also breeds creativity. The Canadians were losing too many tanks. The conventional methods were not working in Holland's unique terrain. They had to try something different or keep dying. Necessity forced them to question the manual. Comfort makes people conservative. Survival makes people creative. When the stakes are high enough, people are willing to test crazy ideas. Some of those ideas turn out to be genius. The story also teaches humility. The German engineers who designed the Tiger were brilliant. They created the most powerful tank of World War II. They thought of everything: thick armor, powerful gun, reliable engine. They tested it thoroughly. They were proud of their work, but they missed the mantlet shot trap, a simple geometric flaw that killed hundreds of their Tigers. Nobody is smart enough to think of everything. Every design has weaknesses. Every plan has flaws. The question is whether you find them before your enemy does. In the end, the Canadians who targeted the wrong spot on Tiger tanks teach us something important about human nature. We trust authority too much. We follow the manual even when the manual is failing. We assume experts must know better than we do, but expertise can become blindness. Experience can become dogma. Sometimes the right answer hides where everyone has been told not to look. Sometimes the impossible is just the difficult that nobody has tried. And sometimes saving lives is as simple as asking why and refusing to accept that the old way is the only way. The Tiger's glass jaw was always there. It just took someone willing to look at the wrong spot to find it.